What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here, just checking in with you today for a very quick little video on abortion and the early Christian teaching on this topic. You may be surprised to know that Christians, Bible-believing Christians, have been passionate about the topic of abortion, specifically protecting young life in the womb, even from our very, very earliest years. In fact, what I want to show you today is actually pretty cool. Of course, at the time that the Bible was finished up with the book of Revelation, Christians continued on to write certain things, documents for the church, creeds and confessions, catechisms, statements of faith, letters to one another, all sorts of Christian material. But the earliest Christian document that we have after the completion of the New Testament, and even before some of the writings of some of the great patristic fathers, is a document called the Didache, which literally means the teaching. Now, to the best of our knowledge, the Didache is either early 2nd century or perhaps even mid to late 1st century. That puts us very, very early on in the history of the Christian church. And what you're going to be surprised to know if you were to read this document is that it actually contains, in the very earliest chapters of the earliest Christian document, the Didache, a section on abortion. Now, it's not a huge section necessarily. We are going to read it here in just a few minutes. But I find it significant that throughout the whole of Christian history, we've been talking about the issue of life. In fact, you could say that Christians are, and continue to be the great preservers of life as we fought against the evil of abortion in every generation. So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share my screen here really quick with you. And I'm going to go over to the article on the Didache here in Wikipedia. Anybody can do this, of course. This doesn't take a theologian to be able to do this. But let's look at this section right here. It says the Didache is a relatively short text of only 2,300 words. The contents may be divided into 4 parts, which most scholars agree were combined from separate sources by a later redactor. The first is called The Two Ways, the Way of Life and the Way of Death, chapters 1 through 6. The second is part of a ritual dealing with baptism, fasting, and communion. And then there's a third section which speaks of the ministry, how to treat apostles, prophets, bishops. It's all very interesting stuff. And then the final section concludes with some thoughts on prophecy, particularly the Antichrist and the second coming of Christ. But what does all this have to do with abortion? Well, let's actually click over to the document itself. This is from ccel.org. And we're going to notice here in section 2. So this is the first section. Here's section 2. Very, very early on in this very early Christian document, we find a statement about abortion. It says this, according to the Didache: this is the second commandment of the teaching. Thou shalt do no murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not corrupt boys. Thou shalt not commit fornication. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not deal in magic. Thou shalt do no sorcery. Thou shalt not murder a child by abortion, nor kill them when they are born. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, and on it goes. It's a very interesting document. What I find so interesting is how early on in the earliest Christian document we have a reference to essentially what we might call the pro-life movement. Christians have always been against the murdering of children in the womb and the murdering of children by laying them aside. Sometimes it's called exposure in the early world. Of course, those are really 2 different ways to do the same thing, and that is to rid oneself of the, quote, burden of having a child. Of course, we know that children are not a burden. They are a great blessing to the church, to families. They are a great blessing to all people to have babies. We love babies. We care for babies. We baptize babies. We teach babies. We instruct them in the ways of the Christian faith. But one thing we do not do and have never done as Christians is kill our own children. And so if you think that the pro-life movement or the anti-abortion movement is something that kind of emerged post Roe v. Wade, or kind of like a late evangelicalism type of subculture, no, that's not true. Christians have always been against murdering children, and we will continue to be against that as long as there is a church. Thank you so much for watching this video. Do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.